Yeah, well, welcome. This is a great crowd. Let's get cranked up here then, and talk about. Well, we've got a small enough crowd where we can talk about whatever you guys want to talk about, but we're going to kick around a few of the predetermined topics first. And my name's Mike Schutt. I'm the executive director of Worldview Academy. I'm coming to you from my living room in Mount Pleasant, Texas, which is also the intergalactic headquarters of Worldview Academy. We also have offices down in Central Texas in Georgetown. And as you know, we do leadership camps around the country and provide resources like this call for families and parents. One of our faculty members is Jay Winslow. Jay has been teaching with Worldview Academy for more than 20 years. I know that. How many would you say exactly, Jay? 25?
Well, I came on with Dell in 2002, so 2023, 24.
Okay. So good. At least 22. Last summer would have been your 22nd summer, probably. But Jay's been teaching with the Worldview Academy faculty team every summer for the past 22 or so summers. He is in the mountains north of Tucson right now. He's an Arizonan, and has taught in public school, private Christian schools, and as I said, at Worldview Academy. And Jay and I are going to have a conversation around a couple of topics, and then whatever you want to talk about, whether it's To Kill a Mockingbird in the running as the great American novel, or what literary character Jay Winslow is most like. We can talk about those things after. I want to kick it off with this question, and that is Jay. We said we're going to talk about Halloween and the new paganism. As we talked about just current issues, we could have chosen some maybe deeper topics, things that aren't as worldviewish in current events. Obviously, there's a war happening, but we thought in terms of worldview topics, with Halloween coming up, this question of the rise of a new paganism or neo-paganism is something that's interesting to you, and it's something that I've noticed over the years, and it's sort of fun to unpack. So could you maybe get us started by saying this is what the new paganism or neo-paganism is, and why have you begun to think about it in connection with Halloween lately?
Well, I think the neo-paganism is basically the old paganism that's always been kind of coming to the fore more recently. And I think you go back to the story in the Garden of Eden, and essentially you either believe that reality has the givenness that God has named it appropriately with, and you live in accordance with that, or you believe that you can be as God yourself and you reject all the former. And I think the thing that made me think about this more recently is when I taught in the public schools, basically from like 1977 until 2010 or so. I took kids through James Sire's The Universe Next Door, which is kind of how I learned worldview on my own, because there wasn't anything else back then. But I basically said, you have these 5 important questions in life. And since this is a worldview crowd, I'll go ahead and say what they all are, because you know them anyway. And they are: what is the nature of reality? What is the nature of a human being? What happens when we die? What is there a basis for ethics and morality? And then finally, what is our purpose? What is human history all about? And I was always trying to, because I'm a simple person, I think I need to understand things simply for myself. I was always trying to kind of take all issues back to a particular worldview question, because I realized after a while that everything kind of went back to how you answered those questions, either in accordance with God or not. And over time, in my attempt to simplify things, I basically told the kids, you've had 3 essential time periods in American history or in Western history where we've answered these questions in certain ways. And they're basically a Judeo-Christian era, kind of a deistic era where we're shifting away from that in the Enlightenment. And then finally, like a naturalistic area where time when we answer things in terms of naturalism and physical causation and explanation. So what I basically said in my attempt to simplify things is those 5 questions way back then used to be answered God, 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 God. And then when we move into the Enlightenment, it's kind of like God, man, God, man, God, man, because now we have our enlightened brains to kind of figure things out with, and that we now live in an age where it's man, 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 man. And sometimes my students would say, well, like, Mr. Winslow, when was this last shift? And I said, it really was about 500 years ago, and I guess where I'm going with this is, if you had asked me, as someone who kind of pays attention to worldview 20 years ago, do I think we would be where we are today, where things to me seem to be moving very, very rapidly? I would have said no, because it seems like, this long shift away from God, which I think is kind of the story of history, has been happening inexorably slowly for hundreds and thousands of years. And I figured it would kind of move like that. But to me, and this is a question that I might ask of all of you, because you're younger and you may not have that same sense of things because you are in a cohort that has not been around as long, you may not feel like things have shifted very radically all of a sudden. But to me, it seems like in the past 5 years, things have just kind of gone crazy. I've heard this quote thrown around a lot lately. There's an old Hemingway quote from The Sun Also Rises, where he's asked about how he went bankrupt. And he said, very slowly, and then all at once, or very suddenly, or something like that. And I kind of feel like the same thing has happened with worldview. Like, things have suddenly changed very radically. And I've kind of wondered about why that is. Now, I've been talking for a while, and I have an idea about why I think that's happened. I don't know whether you want me to go on, or whether you want to say something, Mike, or jump in and.
No, let me make a clarifying point, ask you to make a clarifying point, and then you can tell us why you think that's happened. And then we'll ask if our folks on the call, whether this rings true or not. One is sort of the naturalism and humanism, right? As part of this trend, there's a lot of, so one, let me just make a clarifying point. We're talking about paganism. We're not just talking about not Christian. We're also talking about non-theistic religions, right? I mean, non-theism. Like, we wouldn't call Muslims pagans. We wouldn't call Jews pagans, right? Pagans is a reference to sort of pre-Christian naturalistic religions, right? And so this naturalism is a great fit with neo-paganism. Where do you see humanism fitting in? Is it of a piece, or are these different things?
Well, I mean, I think it's of a piece that when you get to humanism, you're just kind of getting to decide on your own, for whatever reason you might have, the way that you think things are. And again, I think going back to that Garden of Eden story, you either have, God being the creator of the universe, who has defined all things, or, you yourself are as gods and get to kind of make these determinations for yourself. And in some cases, I think, well, and I think probably got to get into this. I think humanism today is kind of like, I will be like the Most High God and make my decisions about all these questions, the nature of reality, the nature of human beings, what happens after death, on my own. And I mean, I think the general view is, as long as I, don't hurt you, I can make any decision I want in that direction. But then you actually have the idea too of the pagan gods, which I think we're going to get into.
Great. Okay. Well, tell us why you think we've entered, or it seems like we have accelerated our paganism, or why the prevailing paganism has accelerated in the broader culture over the last decade.
Okay. And hang with me on this, because I've just been kind of getting to this fairly recently. But when I used to teach worldview to the kids, I would make them memorize the 5 worldview questions that ultimately ended up on a worldview test. I always found that the one that they tended to miss, if they missed any, is, what is the nature of reality? The very first question. And a Christian would say, reality has been defined by the creator God, who has spoken both a physical universe into existence and also a non-physical universe, which is just as much there, even though it's not physical in nature. It was always interesting to me that was the one that they missed. And I thought, well, why is that? And I think it's, in some ways, it's a more subtle question, and yet it's also kind of more all-encompassing too. And I think over time, and you can see this through looking at art or literature or philosophy or whatever, again, there has been this slow, inexorable movement away from a Christian worldview, where human beings aren't created in the image of God. They are highly evolved electrochemical machines. And now we have this question of, can we download our essence into a cloud and live forever in that way? The question of what happens after death? Are we just food for worms, or again, can we upload ourselves into that cloud? Is there a basis for morality? Again, the fundamental moral law used to be the 10 Commandments, but now it can be kind of whatever we feel like, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. And the purpose of life may be completely up in the air to most people these days. But it was interesting to me that they didn't know that the one that they would often miss is, what is the nature of reality? And in thinking about this, in the past couple of years, there is in Western civilization, which I would say is largely under attack today, a general implicit understanding of the givenness of reality that has kind of always been there to some degree. And if you go back to the earliest philosophers, one of the quintessential problems that they had in doing philosophy, which really should be about like quintessential things, not like this highfalutin pie in the sky, it's worthless kind of stuff. It's really very essential. But the early philosophers had three problems. One was one of monarchy. And in that, they realized that if there wasn't a primary source, a monarchy over all of this, something holding all this together, namely a god, a creator god, or the gods, if that wasn't the case and there wasn't something holding it all together, then problem number two arises. You don't have unity in this world in all its diversity. You have, in other words, you can't unify the diversity of all the stuff that's out there. You can't make sense of all this. And then the third problem they had was, if there is no monarchy, then you cannot have comprehensibility, you have chaos. So the very first philosophers understood, if there wasn't a creator God, and I think this is very sensible, if there wasn't someone who had made this and named it all, then it wasn't unified and it was completely chaotic. It was a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury and signifying nothing. So the interesting thing about this is, implicit in the very earliest philosophizing is this idea, although they couldn't name who the monarch was at that point, that there has to be a monarch or it just doesn't make sense. Okay, so then what happens is Jesus comes along, he lives his life, he dies on the cross, and you have this amazing Colossians 2:15 verse that says, in dying on the cross, he triumphs over powers and principalities, and he strips them bare, naked to mockery. It's kind of like a military terminology that's used in that sense. And that he basically, in the God-man who comes to earth and dying on a cross for sin, he establishes a new jurisdiction that says, I'm God, I've entered into this, I'm in control of it all. And that's kind of, I think, what that Colossians 2:15 verse is all about. So then you have Paul, who goes into Athens in Acts 17 and says, hey, you guys, you seem to get that there's all these gods, or, but you're not sure about this one who doesn't have a name. And I'm telling you, this God that you don't know the name of, it's Jesus. That's who it is, So in all of this, even before the Christian age, you have this implicit understanding that there has to be a maker. You then have Jesus, who is the maker, coming in and redeeming us and announcing this new jurisdiction. You have Paul saying Jesus is, the God who has become flesh and who dwells among us. And all those things are implicitly talking about a givenness of things. Rocks are rocks, trees are trees, gravity is gravity, men are men, women are women. And then in the moral sphere, the whole idea of virtue being inherent in the created physical order, that again, someone like Joseph Pieper would say, this is one of the monumental understandings that humans have had, that in this non-physical universe that we have, that we get that there is a way we should behave and we have to enact it. And that may take courage, and that may require deprivation of us in the form of temperance. And then the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love. So where I'm going with this, and I'm sorry, this is kind of long-winded, but that Western civilization, which is what, what our world has always kind of been based on, even before the Christian age, implicitly understood that there was a creator behind it all. And that now the very idea that there is a givenness to things and a way that we should behave, whether you're saying it's from the Greeks or the Romans or the Jews or the Christians, that's the very thing that's under attack, is the givenness of the created order that would only come from a creator God. So whereas all these other worldview questions have kind of been shifting away for millennia in subtle ways, you now have this undermining of this very core principle that reality has a given nature that comes from a creator God. And I think I know I've mentioned this before. There's a book by Natasha Crane called Faithfully Different. And she says that we now live in a world where happiness is the ultimate goal, feelings are the ultimate guide, judgment is the ultimate sin. So to say things are a certain way and that you should behave a certain way or something like that, or that this is wrong or that this is right, that is now considered the ultimate sin, when in many ways, I would say those are the very foundations of what Western civilization has always been about and what the institutions have kind of reflected to make civilization function in a solid way. So in thinking about all this, like how that question number one, which often gets disregarded, is now being undermined in this idea that there's a givenness to the created order. I then read, a friend sent me an article by Naomi Wolf, who is a secular Jewish feminist who I never would have thought this from, who has written an article, and I don't remember the name of it, so I got to read it real quick here. What's the name of the article? It is called, and it's on Substack if you want to look this up, Have the Ancient Gods Returned? And she, in reading a book by Jonathan Cahn, who I think is kind of a conservative pastor, a completed Jew, has come to the conclusion as someone who's fairly secular, that she now has to deal with the question of evil in raw form in a way that she's never had to before. And again, all I kind of come back to is we are now completely undermining anything that's Western, and again that Western idea of having a givenness that comes from God is now being undermined. And what she says in this article, in which Jonathan Cahn says, is that in the kind of abandoning of that idea that is implicit in Western thinking, we are allowing an opportunity for the ancient gods, the Baals, the Molochs, the Asherahs, to kind of fill the void that has been cleaned with the cleaning of the house. And now 7 spirits more evil than that will come and fill it. Because that's just me trying to kind of make sense of how rapidly this seems to have changed when it seemed to be moving at a certain pace for so long. There you go. There's a big dump.
Wow, big dump there. But one fairly simple way to say it is once the idea of a creator God that's designed the world is gone, there's a lot that goes with it with regard to who we are, what's real, particularly when you look at the created order. It's a catastrophic shift.
Yeah.
Matthew, do you have your hand up, or are you just saying hello? If you have your hand up, go ahead and
Yes.
Yeah, jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention this is an interesting topic because I was just at a conference, Magnify conference, that was talking about this specific issue. And one of the things that stuck out to me about what you were saying about that very rapid shift is something that Carl Truman at the conference spoke about, which is it wasn't rapid. We just didn't see it coming. And a great thought experiment he gave to look at this was if you grew up in a small town in the year 1200, your identity, or the answer to the question, who are you, is, well, I'm the son of so and so, and I've been here my whole life, and I'm going to die over there, and I'm going to get buried in that grave, and I'm going to do the same job that my dad did, and all that kind of deal. And your position in society was a fixed one. And fast forward 100 years, and it's the same answers as before. It doesn't really change. So the world was fixed. fixed, and your identity within the world was fixed. And everybody else knows what your role is, and you know what your role is. And as soon as you take that away, which is effectively what a lot of things starting in like the 1600s and onward have done, is taken away a lot of the anchors that define who we are. And so when we remove those anchors like the family and the church,
Right.
then we're left to decide these kind of things on our own. And when that happens, we we have to find some sort of authority, and that authority is normally our feelings, as we can see in the abortion issue and in the LGBTQ stuff and a lot of the crazy ideas that have come in our culture. It's not about some logical stance. It's about, well, my feelings say this, and if something else goes against that, then my feelings are right and that is wrong.
Yeah. That's good. And Truman's work is helpful here, right? I think there it is, right there, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. That's a highly recommended book. But thank you, Matthew, for that. Jay, what
Well,
do you
and
think?
that
Hand
makes
in
me
glove,
think of,
right?
well, and he talks about Philip Reef in the book, who says that in the past we, kind of found our identities in the way that we related to the institutions, like the church, or I think he has Financial Man in the 19th century, kind of relating to, Marxism or capitalism or whatever, and how to kind of make your way in the world. And then in the 20th century, we have Psychological Man. But I think that's another question that I have had, in the past 5 years. And this is just kind of me rabble rousing, but it's kind of like, what institutions, if they're kind of the bedrock of society on which we feel things are solid, what institutions do we still trust? And my brother was schooled in journalism and he doesn't trust journalism. I was schooled in education and I don't trust education. You know, thought experiment, but like, who do we still trust as an institution? And that's
Lawyers,
I
Jay. Lawyers are trusted, as you know.
I mean, I would say the number one thing that we can trust is the Bible, of course, and
yes,
that is a huge anchor. And then on top of that, flowing out from that would be the family and the church. And of course, that depends on your specific local church and your specific family. But especially for Christians, I think that that's something that can be depended upon.
yes. And I think
Well,
that's the ultimate conclusion to arrive at. I always kind of like, I want the Bible to be my ultimate epistemology.
well, and that's the thing. What I've seen in the lightning whiplash shift during the same time period is a decline in uh, submission to and respect for authority, including the scriptures, right? And so, hand in hand with the rise of the authority of feelings, with the goal of happiness, we also have a decline among believers in seeing the importance of reading and internalizing the scripture and seeing it as the ultimate standard. It's just an ancient book that has some great suggestions in it for ethical living. It's not God's revelation of himself, and by no means is it God's authority for how we should live. Because I think Matthew's exactly right that the place you have to go, the only bedrock institution, is the scripture. The institution that goes with that, as he says, is the family, but the church is the mediator too, in that not between man and not between man and God, but the mediator of the relationship in the family and scripture as well. And so those institutions have come under huge attack, particularly in the past 5 years.
Yes.
If you're listening in and you want to comment but you don't want to unmute and talk, you should feel free to type questions into the chat box. But you're also free to just unmute and speak, even if you can't, if you don't know how to raise your hand like Matthew did. Don't let that bother you. Feel free to just jump in if you have a comment or question for Jay or for me, or you want to jump in on the conversation.
Well, and let me just kind of throw this in too, that Naomi Wolf article. And again, I'm not real aware of this because I don't keep up on a lot of this stuff, but she talks about how a lot of these pagan deities have kind of shown themselves, or that there are, like in various, I don't know, Super Bowl halftime shows, that there is an iconography that it's kind of like patterned after some of these ancient deities. And that, like, there was even a temple of Baal where the archway that formerly had been in Syria and was destroyed by ISIS in 2015 was meticulously rebuilt and then moved to the mall in front of the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and there was some ceremony about like this. Well, I don't know if they called it the Temple of Baal, but that's what it is. I'm like, why is this kind of stuff happening? It just seemed kind of crazy. And I wasn't even aware of a lot of it. So that's very interesting too. That again, the void is being filled by the ancient deities.
Jay, what do you think about the idea that neo-paganism has crept into the church as well, right? That we don't like the structures of religion, right? But we want to be spiritual, and so there's a disembodied spirituality that we chase after, rather than a concrete, incarnate walking out of the, not just the liturgy, right, or the day-to-day doings of the local congregation, but a walking out of concrete life with, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but duty and virtue, the things that you're talking about that Pieper extrapolates from this question of the givenness of creation, that there's something in the created order that we're part of. We're incarnate beings. We receive creation. We're not just making our marks on it. And there's something out there that's real that we have to discover and align ourselves with. Instead, even in the church, we're saying, well, I'm just getting in touch with something out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and again, I'm thinking of like moral therapeutic deism. We like all the fruit of Christianity. We like the idea of wisdom and justice and courage and temperance, but they're not rooted in anything real. And if they're not rooted in anything real, then you're just kind of playing a game, which kind of, I know we're probably not ready to go into the second part of this, but that is this idea that in our Imago Dei, we have this sense that there is a way that life should be lived and that all these things are good. But again, the sacrifice and the commitment and the handing ourselves over to God in order to have these things is not something that we want to do. Well, and I think what we're going to talk about is, because I was thinking, and again, this is me, I always have to go back to very simple ideas because, like I said, when I was first learning worldview, after doing it for a few years, I was like, man, everything always goes back to how you answer these 5 questions. And, are you answering it the way God answers it? And if you do that, you can kind of figure things out. And this is just kind of the whole idea of well, I was thinking 2 things. I was thinking C.S. Lewis's Law of Human Nature in Mere Christianity always kind of blows me away, because at the end of that very first chapter, he says, these 2 facts explain the universe and everything in it. And I'm like, what? What explains the universe and everything in it? And he says, it's this idea that we think we should behave a certain way, and yet none of us actually do behave that way. So I think that's kind of the first thing I was thinking of that is kind of in line with this. And then the second thing is something that I didn't realize until I had started working with Worldview. And I learned this idea from Jeff Baldwin, and I'd never heard this before, even though I'd been teaching English for 23, 24 years at that point. And that's the Dorothy Sayers idea of the dogma is the drama. That, again, created in the Imago Dei, we kind of have this internal sense that the ultimate story is creation, fall, redemption, restoration, that we know life should be a certain way and it should always be moving toward that resolution, even though we don't quite know how to participate in all that. And again, this is the idea, and I just kind of found this remarkable because it explains so much so quickly, and it's an idea that I never thought about. And I would always say this to this day amazes me. and I'm 68 years old, but I know there's all kinds of ideas out there that I haven't thought about yet, that when I think about them, I'm going to go like, wow, that's just like, wow, how did I not think of that before? And it's funny because I'm thinking that in my classes, when we were presenting all these worldviews, and I always kind of try to be objective about it and not say that I was a Christian, my students would say like, "Hey, Winslow, how do we know which worldview is true?" And I had a poster on the wall with a quote from Archbishop Leslie Newbegin, and it said, "Worldviews commend themselves to us by their beauty, their rationality, and their comprehensive explanatory power." And I think when I heard this idea of the dogma is the drama, which is essentially the idea in fiction, and I hope I explained this to Jeff's satisfaction, but it's this idea that we know that things should move towards a favorable resolution. I mean, when you watch the beginning of Star Wars, nobody immediately sides with Darth Vader and hopes that he wins. He's the bad guy and that he shouldn't win, and that ultimately there should be some kind of positive resolution. And that was one of those ideas when I first heard it that was beautiful, that was rational, and that explained kind of like everything. I was like, wow. And so, I mean, I guess one thing I would say is I know there's more ideas like that all over the place out there. And I'm like, I want to keep knowing those things because it's so cool when you find those things out. So that's kind of the idea that we were thinking about, Mike, is just kind of going in the direction of this sense that we all have that things should be moving in a particular direction, and that most of those ideas about how things should be are kind of implicit in our being created in the image of God and understanding those things inherently, even though the world is often not going in those directions.
Well, and this is connected too to C.S. Lewis's idea in The Abolition of Man, right?
Yes.
The idea of there is a natural order of things that everybody has always recognized, regardless of their connection to Christianity. It's their connection to humanness that is this idea of the Tao, right? That says this is what is naturally true in the nature of things, and I think it's that he decries in The Abolition of Man, right? He says, wait a minute, we've moved away from an idea where we even recognize that we all want to act a certain way. We long to be a certain kind of person, and yet we don't do it. Instead, we accept our not doing it as the normal, and then we chalk it up to the randomness or the chaos of human nature rather than to sin or something wrong with the world or something wrong with us. And what we're left with is what the ancient pagan philosophers would have called chaos. And so here we are in a world where we're the ultimate judge. We're unreliable judges. We don't have mediating institutions that we trust to get us right. And of course, we're unmoored from traditional faith. And so even this question of what's in the natural order of things, how can we look to the creation itself as evidence of a creator, is off the table. And so
Yeah.
we're adrift.
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out as well that I think that the idea of natural revelation is really important in apologetics, because a lot of people may say, "Oh, I don't trust the Bible. I think the Bible's crazy." But you can appeal to natural order and natural law and say, "Well, if we look at how the world is, we can tell that this or that is how it should be," kind of thing. And I think that that's a tool that we can definitely use in the apologetic space as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great point. And it really goes to the second topic that we're sort of, I don't know, we're wandering toward it anyway. I might as well just throw it on the table and we can go back and forth in this, although we haven't mentioned Halloween yet. I feel I don't want to be have false advertising, so I'll let Jay say a few words about why Halloween reminds him of the new paganism, and then I'll probably have a rant or two. But the idea here that we've seen a couple of really, the most famous book out there right now is Tom Holland's Dominion. Tom Holland is not a Christian, but he just writes about how the Western world is how it is because of the influence of Christianity. It's turned the world on its head, and all of the things that even the unreligious, a-religious, pagan world, the non-Christian world sees and embraces as the standard by which we judge, comes from Christianity, not from pre-Christian, not from any pre-Christian ideals. The idea that people should be kind, even the idea of non-judgment in the sense that most secularists see it, is an idea of, you know, treating your neighbor as yourself, doing unto others as others would have, do unto others as you would have others do unto you, the golden rule. All of this stuff that we see in the world, like equality, the rise in the last 15 years of the idea of consent and autonomy. None of that's even possible without a Christian worldview that has at least some of these things as byproducts of the Christian world. I think of another book by Glenn Scrivener called The Air We Breathe. He says Christianity is the air we breathe. We don't recognize that people think of kindness as a virtue, and it would be somehow unusual to live in a world where kindness was seen as something neutral or unnecessary, and yet kindness in the pre-Christian world was, well, it wasn't that important. The way that power was abused and used in the pre-Christian world was different. We can look at the behavior of the gods in the ancient myths, right, and see that everything is turned on its head. And so this idea of the dogma being the drama is related to this, in that we see the way it ought to be. We know, we see the story, we see what's good, but we don't realize how directly influenced we are by 2,000 years of Christian culture and history, and even those who reject it out of hand and say, oh no, I'm my own God, I am autonomous, I am the one who makes up the rules. We are still living by the straight line of Christianity.
You know, and something, I mean, you're just kind of reminding me, in talking about the abolition of man, something else that Lewis says in there is that the ancients, again, used to line up with that givenness of reality, and that was considered wisdom, to conform the soul to that, but that moderns try to find a technology that allows them to do an end around reality. And I think that's another of the problems now. I mean, I think, again, we've always been moving away from God in our understanding of those 5 questions. But now we have these technologies, you know, that allow us to, you know, prevent having babies. Contraception, I think, was the one when I was a young man, that was kind of like, wait, are the rules of sexuality the same if there's now this technology that allows this to be different? You know, and now if we abandon the idea of a givenness of reality that kind of comes in the package of Western civilization, and we now have these technologies that allow us to alter our physical bodies, then you can perhaps understand why people might be saying, you know, do I have to be a man? I mean, is the technology there to make me a woman? And is there therefore a reality of my manness, or can I actually be a woman? And Lewis wrote that in 43, which I think was just kind of astounding that he was so far ahead of things in that way. Let me throw another book in that is, I don't think it's called this anymore, Under the Influence, How Christianity Transformed Civilization. I think it's now called How Christianity Transformed Civilization. And this is by Alvin J. Schmidt. This is almost kind of like textbook in nature, but I use this a lot with my classes when I was teaching government, just because it does talk about you know, the whole idea of the rule of law and government and emancipation of women and, you know, protection of infants from infanticide and abolition of slavery. And that, again, all of these are Christian ideas, that dogma is the drama. So
yeah, that's good. That's a good, I typed one of the references into the chat box. We can type the other ones in as well. And so the technological piece is interesting too, Jay. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's not, well, Alan Jacobs calls the move that says it's not the physical reality, it's not the givenness of my body that matters, but it's what's in my head, right? That's what determines what I am. And if I have enough resources, enough funds, I can purchase that technology that can change the reality, right? This is Lewis's point that you're making in the abolition of man. In the abolition of man, I can purchase and find the technology to change me physically, to change the givenness, to manipulate it in a perverse, twisted way. And so Jacob says that the whole movement here is really just a Gnostic consumer capitalism, right? That says this is Gnosticism, and yet we have the technological tools. As long as we have the resources, we have a capitalism that allows us to change reality. But it's a lie, of course. It's super interesting to think about it that way.
Well, we could jump into the other thing I was thinking about here if you want to.
Let's do it.
All right. So when I bring this up, this isn't a not endorsement, but I was thinking about Ted Lasso.
Yeah.
As far as this idea of the dogma is the drama. And let me tell you my history with this TV program, which I would not necessarily endorse. I think it originally came out a couple of years ago in the height of COVID. I think maybe I watched a couple episodes a couple of years ago because someone had said, "Oh, that's good." And, when I opened up my screen one day, I saw it as an option. And I think I watched 2, maybe 3 episodes. But to be quite honest with you, I was kind of put off by the sexuality and the language. And I kind of felt like, all right, I mean, I'm kind of watching this guy who's kind of like a Gomer Pyle, country bumpkin, spouting positive aphorisms. And that seems kind of nice, but, there's so much crud on the side here that I'm not interested. So I didn't watch it anymore. And that was, again, I think when it came out. More recently, I would say like in the past 6 months, again, somebody else that I know said, "Oh, you're watching Ted Lasso, right?" And then later they made some reference to like, it being really a wholesome show. And I thought, did I miss something on that? And should I go back and watch it? So I actually did. I went back and then watched the first season again. And I felt the same way, like, man, there's a lot of crud that I'm having to wade through here. But again, a lot of that is probably the fact that I'm 68, and the law of diminishing returns says that, the violence and the sexuality is always going to get bigger and bigger and bigger in everything we watch. And I'm not quite used to that until I kind of get a little bit more used to it. But I did watch the rest of the first season, and I was kind of won over, like I guess many people were, by Ted Lasso in that first season. And then I read a little bit about it, and I guess it was nominated for 20 different Emmys and won, a whole slew of them. But what I thought was interesting about Ted Lasso in that very first season is that he's a very Christ-like character. And what is so winsome and appealing to him is that idea of the dogma being the drama. That even though all these, and I won't go into all the details of the show, but even though all these people around him are behaving very crassly, he is forgiving of them when they personally, offend him. And he is almost, I wouldn't say he prays for his enemies, but he is very understanding and sympathetic to them and still looking for their best interests.
Yeah.
And there's all this stuff that I'm like, this is such a Christian idea. I wonder where this is going to go, because that dogma is the drama idea has to ultimately be rooted in the idea that, again, there actually is a creator God who has given us this internal sense of this way we should behave, even though the alienation of our sin prevents us from doing that. So I thought, what are they going to do with Ted Lasso in the second season? I mean, is he going to be a Christian in some way, which in no way was indicated in the very first season? So I watched the second season, and, it's kind of like they couldn't root it in some kind of Christian character. And they pretty explicitly were not going to do that. They still had a few Christian ideas, like, there is a scene where somebody else in this takes in all these people kind of from the highways and byways on Christmas to feed them. And, there's a sense of goodwill about that. but I kind of felt like, wow, this show has nowhere to go. And then I never watched the third season because everybody just said it got worse. So I just kind of found I found it interesting as a cultural phenomenon that people get this idea that we want to see people who behave a certain way, but that the show, it seems, deteriorated because it had nothing real to root it in that we could understand.
There was
And
no foundation. Yeah.
foundation for it. Yeah. So like I said, I'm not going to recommend it. It was amazing how I was won over by him in watching the first season, because I kind of felt like, gosh, you can't help but admire this and be drawn into it. But like I said, there was nothing to support it. So interesting idea. The dogma is the drama, but no foundation for that being meaningful.
That's super good. And we see it in, well, we see it in real life too, not just in literature, where these things have to be rooted in something. In fact, our last month or the month before, we talked about the Barbie movie, right? And we had a real tension in talking about, wow, this is a really thoughtful exploration of what it means to be a woman, but it is completely divorced from a mooring in teachings of the church or Christian faith or whatever. And so it makes it a little bit disjointed. It makes it hard to watch. It makes it hard to understand. It makes it hard to interpret. So it's fun to do that with literature, but we also see it in life, right? Where we say our goodness is the opposite of goodness if it is not rooted in God's righteousness. Even our righteousness is filthy rags. Even our efforts become Phariseeism. Our following the law becomes legalism. The drama tends to wickedness, to evil, to legalism, to abuse, even with the best of intentions, with unredeemed action and human beings, right? I see it in my own life. I see it in the lives of those around me, right? It's just a fundamental reality about the human condition. You're just buying that?
Sure, I buy that.
Okay. All right. That's good. So Jay, do you hate Halloween and see it as a sign of neo-paganism, and anyone who dresses up as a Mouseketeer or as a cute cute alien is participating in neo-paganism? Please say no, but do you?
No.
Good. Okay, that's awesome. All right.
And you
Good.
know what? It's funny. I think as someone who became a Christian in 1973, for whom all these things that I had formerly participated in without understanding the meaning, when I finally became a Christian, I'm like, wow, Christmas, like, wow, it's such a meaningful time. And yet I could see how the culture was commercializing it and denigrating it in that way. I think what I found interesting since then is I was just in Lowe's the other day, where, like doing some tile work, and we had to pick up some tile. And there are like these 25-foot tall mechanized monster things that you can buy that growl and snap their teeth at you. And I've heard all these people are like, Halloween is my favorite holiday. And I'm like, really? it just seems weird that you would not get Christmas, and that Halloween, with all its macabre, horrific ideas, would be your favorite holiday. That's just odd.
Yeah, I have a very unpopular hot take. Well, it's not hot anymore; it's lukewarm
Right.
on Halloween. But let's do Christmas first, right? Christmas is a great holiday celebrating our Savior's birth. It's wrapped up in images of the incarnation. It's a time where we sing praise and carols, and I mean, it's just awesome. But the intention of the early church in moving it to the winter solstice or whatever, I mean, that was a pure, flat out cultural move of redemption that the church is supposed to do. That's what we do with holy days. That's what they're for. And we had the 12 days of Christmas, and we had developed a season of Advent before it. And then we got co-opted by the culture. Christmas as celebrated in much of the West is so materialistically consumer oriented that it is easy to not be a Christian and celebrate Christmas, right? And so I think part of the popularity of Halloween is that it's not a Christian holiday. But my hot take on Halloween is it was the co-opted holiday before Christmas was. I think the old the church in the 4th century celebrated the martyrs and the saints and moved the celebration of the martyrs and the saints from May in the 800s to co-opt the Celtic and Druid festivals of the dead, and said, hey, this is a better way to think about those who've gone before. This is a better way to think about death. This is a better way to think about the afterlife, is to think about martyrdom, giving one's life, about what your life is, what is reality. At least that's my read on what All Hallows was. And All Hallows Eve was the time to remember the saints and to celebrate those who've gone before. So Halloween, I think, historically could be seen as an originally Christian holiday, but we let the pagans take it back. And I think the cultural being taken by Halloween has a lot to do with the fact that it's not Christmas.
Yeah. You
Yeah.
reminded me in the 2nd season of Ted Lasso, where
We're
Ted
going to
goes
go back to Ted Lasso, are we?
Well,
I'm
no,
trying
this-
to have a rant about Halloween. Okay, go ahead.
The only reason I'm thinking of this is because in the second season, like I said, there is this kind of like banquet where people are called in from the highways and byways. Ted and the owner of the team go out and give gifts to the less fortunate. There are all these very Christian ideas, but Christmas is referenced as Santa's birthday. And I just noticed someone said Santa was the happy, fun god of Christmas. That's kind of what reminded me of that. Is it's kind of like they're borrowing all this stuff, to kind of get an emotional rise, but it's not really rooted in anything that is redemptive.
That's good. That's good. And we have a worldview, I think, it's still in the Worldview Academy notebook, I think, called Santaism, right? Where God is, it's sort of the happy deism, the happy moralistic therapeutic deism place, a worldview that says God just exists to give us good things and to make us happy. Christy says that she likes Father Christmas in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe better than Santa. Of course, Santa is Saint Nick, right? We used to have a feast of Saint Nicholas. We still do on December 6th, but it's not really celebrated. And Santa is the big fun guy that's taken over Christmas. You were going to say something about Father Christmas, I think, Jay.
No.
No, I mean, I think I agree with Christy. It's a great character in Narnia, and it's not surprising that he would use Father Christmas, right? A more pagan, a more natural, not pagan, but a more naturalistic, I don't know, maybe pagan, naturalistic figure in his mythical world. If you got Christ as a lion, you can have Father Christmas as a representation of the natural, natural theology or the created order, the moral order. Yeah, awesome. So when you go to your fall festivals at church, be sure to say, "Oh, I see we've let the pagans take Halloween back over. Let's celebrate the saints instead." Yeah, that's great. Paige says we also have Lewis using Bacchus, the Greek god, right, of revelry and wine. That's a great point. He uses the pagan gods specifically and a river god. That's a great point. Yep, absolutely. Not surprising that this medievalist would turn back. Yeah, super good.
Understanding
So, Mike,
theology that is true.
What's that,
Mike,
Jay?
Understanding, Lewis said that Christianity was like, I don't remember exactly how he said it. It was mythology that had that was true, that had become real or something like that.
Yeah, the true myth,
True
the
myth.
great myth that became true. Matthew, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Mike, you were referencing how historically Halloween was All Saints Day, it was like the eve of All Saints Day and that kind of thing. Talking about like Christian ideas being taken over by pagan ones. I'm curious, if you don't want to go into it, it's fine, but a lot of similar things have happened in the feminist movement and in the the Christian view on like headship or like men and women's roles in a marriage and things like that. I'm curious what you think about how a lot of Christians have been co-opted into a lot of more feminist ideologies when those were historically completely opposed by the church.
Yeah, that's a great point. The irony that I have with like Christmas and Halloween is that the church was actually taking a redemptive, right? This is a countercultural thing to call something a holy day simply by naming it, right? And saying we are going to think about these things instead of these things. And so the irony of letting them be re-co-opted by the culture is just funny to me, both with Christmas and Halloween. And we're more likely to spend time in the festivals of Mother's Day and other cultural holidays than we are in some of the traditional holidays. But your point is a good one, that there are things in the church itself. There's theology, there's doctrine, there are practices within the body of Christ that have been completely co-opted by culture. It's what it has, instead of the church being countercultural, we have often been co-opted by the cultural moment, cultural fads. I think feminism is a good example, just in the sense of um, we see the importance of the rights and dignity of all human beings, and women and men being on equal footing in the world based on the way that the Christian well, Christianity has influenced culture, right? It's even different from an Old Testament um, ethic of many wives, etc., and the powerful men being able to control. In the New Testament and in Jesus' teaching, he speaks to women. He had women disciples. There were women deaconesses that served in the church, etc. And so the whole idea of the equality of the sexes and the equality of there's no Jew and Greek, all the rest, right? The whole idea of equality and the elimination of class distinctions within the church was a big deal. And then and then to have that turned on its head culturally is well, it's tough to see.
And all those dividing walls that have been broken down seem to be re-erected in our current culture.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked about the new feminism, biological realist feminism. Erica Bachiochi has written a book called The Rights of Women. I don't believe she's a Christian, but I don't know. But she's sort of cobbled together a consortium of women who say we desire to think about being a woman in a sex real way, biologically, that it's rooted in biological reality, that it means something to be a woman that's different than what it means to be a man. And it's true for men too, they say. And so she got folks from across the political and religious spectrum talking about how viewing what's given, what's real in nature, is the basis for part of understanding the dignity of women, which is one of the things I found interesting about the Barbie movie, was this idea that there's something in the nature of things about it, what it means to be a woman. It doesn't have anything to do with jobs or or freeing yourself from the bonds of children and all the rest. In fact, it's probably the opposite. And I thought those were interesting ideas coming from someone who would not claim to be a Roman Catholic anymore, Greta Gerwig. Good. Other questions? Type them up in the chat. We're winding down here, and happy to talk about the things that you guys want to talk about.
That's just making me think again about a Joseph Pieper quote where it's his definition. It's a quotation from the Middle Ages where he says, a wise man tastes all things as they actually taste, which is again, this reference to understanding the givenness of things is what leads to wisdom, which
that's awesome.
we're overthrowing wholesale these days.
I'm reading a book by a guy named Dan Brenzel right now called Answering Speech. It's the best book I've ever read on prayer. I'm not finished with it, but this morning I was reading in it, and he makes a similar point about the givenness of creation. And he talks about, why is it that we pray for the spring rains and for daily bread? Because of all the things we know God is going to give us, rain is one that seems the most given. It always rains. Rain comes in the spring, and for God to say, pray for the spring rains, seems silly because one, we know he's going to provide it. And so he says there are two things about those kinds of prayers that we're actually commanded to pray, the specific things that we know God gives us, that he's already determined to give us. And he says one of the things is that we realize how it helps us realize how we see the givenness of creation. That instead of seeing rain as something that's naturally there, that just happens as a matter of course, we see it as God's provision for us, as part of the natural order that is given to us, that sustains us, that gives us life, that brings life and refreshment. And so to pray for something that's already in the cards to happen, that God has already decided to do, is akin to a child asking a mom, or a mom telling a child, no, you need to ask for that. You need to ask for that. The mom's already decided to give that child that thing, and yet she wants the child to understand something about that thing, that it comes from something else, that it's a good thing, that it's worth asking for, that's worth waiting for. And then that we can see it as a gift is a pretty cool thing. But that's wrapped up in this question of the givenness of nature, that it's given by someone for our good. And to see it that way changes how we live in it.
Wow.
Pretty good stuff.
It is good. That is.
All right. Other questions? I'll give you a minute or two if you want to jump in. Just unmute and scream at me and rant about Jay and all the crazy things that Jay has said. In addition, you can feel free to chat.
I'll throw in another book here real quick. This is called Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, A Breviary of Sin by Cornelius Plantinga. And I think I just got this book, I don't know, a few months back, and I started to read it. And I think it came out in like 95, and maybe it was like somebody's book of the year. But again, just this notion of how, the pervasiveness of sin was something that we used to be aware of, and it was referenced all the time, and now the very notion that you would say you shouldn't do that, or that's bad, or whatever, that's like the ultimate thing you can do wrong, is to make a judgment. But this is a very interesting book.
That's cool. Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, A Breviary of Sin. Cornelius Plantinga. Jay, the question for you is, why is there a wheelbarrow in your living room?
You know what? I think that wheelbarrow, believe it or not, is filled with pumpkins and cantaloupes and potatoes. It's the harvest. It's harvest time here on the ranch.
But you need to tell them you're not actually in your living room.
I'm not actually in my living room. This is a pole barn, and we live upstairs, and we have kind of turned the downstairs into kind of a game room, kitchen, quasi living room over there. My wife's trying to do that. But right now, like I said, you have to age pumpkins at a certain temperature or something like that. and that's why they're over there in the wheelbarrow.
I always age my pumpkins at a precise 67 degrees.
I mean, I think they're supposed to be like 80 degrees or something like that, which we're not pulling off here right now. So
Question on the pagan gods. Do you think they're real in the sense of being demons or something, and not to be worshipped? It's an interesting question.
you know what? Let me. This is an interesting. There's a podcast now, and maybe you guys have heard of this, called Haunted Cosmos. And I've listened to a few of them, and they're really kind of fascinating. And it goes into some of those ideas. And one of them, and I can't think of the guy's name now, is the idea of, like, what is this transcendent realm? Is it and I can't think of the guy's name right now. Is it just demons masquerading as gods, or are they, like, kind of like lesser demigods to the creator God who has spoken all things into existence? And some people have sent me some of this stuff, and I've listened to some of these things, and it's very fascinating. I don't know that I have a very defined opinion on all that. I think the first time I listened to some of this stuff, I'm like, you still got God and you still got demons, and God is who wins. I had to kind of simplify it so that I could kind of move on, but I have been paying attention more to that. Does anybody know the name of the guy I'm talking about?
How about Brian Suave?
No.
What do you got, Paige?
Brian
Can you say it out loud?
Sauvé.
It's Brian Sauvé is the guy who does the podcast.
Sauvé.
It is, yeah, Haunted Cosmos.
SAUV.
Who is the
Paige.
theologian who gets into some of this? I mean, I think he died recently of, like, pancreatic cancer. He was only 60 something, but he's
I'm not sure. The most I've read up on angelology and demonology is coming from, like, Augustine and the City of God. So
that's
wow.
stuff.
Yeah.
Well, and just on that question too, G.K. Chesterton hints, at least in Everlasting Man, he talks about the gospel goes west instead of east, and he talks about Moloch and Baal and those as demonic forces of evil. And he says in the east, the Roman house gods. I mean, those are just cultural creations, right? And so in my mind, I always have it. There are the gods that the pagan culture sacrificed children to, right? And you think of those as more on the demonic side, but then you think of Zeus and Athena and Hera as literary creations, and that's at least in my mind. And it's interesting, right? I read Homer with our homeschoolers in the community, and I'm like, yeah, I don't think the big temptation is to worship Zeus or Athena. There's a different thing going on here in the pagan worldview than the worship of those false gods. And interestingly, speaking of podcasts, next week, episode 10 of Mindset, my podcast with Worldview Academy, is on monsters, and we touch on this question of what's monstrous. And I comment a little bit on the question of the difference between monsters and demons and their depiction in classical art. But my guest is a philosophy professor from Bethlehem College and Seminary, and he talks about the idea of monsters and our attraction to them in literature and film as a question that has really made him wonder about aesthetics, and if it says something about either our disordered desires or about something else, about human nature or something. So it's the podcast is called Mindset with Mike Schutt, so part of the Worldview Academy podcast network. I'm not even paying for this advertising slot that I just created.
And someone just mentioned that theologian's name was Michael Heiser.
Michael Heiser
gets into some of this a little bit.
Thanks, guys. Good. Well, I see it's 8:44. It's about time for us to shut it down. But if somebody's got a burning, if they've just said, I should have unmuted and spoken before he closed it down, go ahead, do it. I'll take another comment or question for Jay or for me or for everybody.
I was just gonna say that our church is really big on celebrating Reformation Day, so Halloween sort of falls by the wayside. But Kevin, my husband, likes to say that we're just plundering the Egyptians for their candies. We still
That's
go out
awesome. I think
trick-or-treat.
that's perfect. Talk about co-opting the culture, taking their candy by celebrating the Reformation Day. I love it. What a great compromise. That's pretty great.
We're loading
Next
up with
page.
Kit Kats before we go.
That's right. Jay, I hope you have 2 candy bars just in case someone comes to your house
I will.
there in the middle of nowhere trick-or-treating.
I'll give them a whole bar if they come to my house.
Woo! All right. Now you never know. One last comment says some would say that avoiding neighbors and hiding is less Christian than passing out candy. What would you say to that, to a non-Christian? I love passing out candy to my neighbors. So I don't hide. I love it. It's fun to see the kids coming through, but I know there are people that as a matter of conscience that Halloween really is a pagan holiday. Again, I disagree, but there's sure room for that within the body of Christ. Maybe you could compromise by pelting your neighbors with candy, or just saying Happy Reformation Day when you hand it out.
Yes.
Awesome. Great. Well, Jay Winslow has been my guest on this edition of Worldview Conversations. Jay, thanks for doing this. Sure appreciate it. All right. Hey, thanks everybody for joining us. Our next conversation, I think I wrote it down here somewhere, is November 20th, Monday, November 20th. If we have to pivot, it would be Tuesday, November 21st, but I believe our schedule is 7:30 Central Time on Monday, November 20th. So thanks for joining us. Have a great night.
Good night, everybody.